Okay, welcome to our webinar. We just have a few people that we're waiting on to attend, so we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. If you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat function uh, and go ahead and just type in any questions you have during the presentation. And we're planning to leave about 10 or 15 minutes or so at the end to go basically do any kind of question and answer. So again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And we're going to, just so you know, we'll break up the presentation. I'll be speaking first, be talking about the process of applying for accommodations for students with learning differences and other kinds of issues. And then after that, Tina will be talking more specifically about what you need to think about in terms of the colleges that you're applying to and the kinds of accommodations that are provided. I've also provided the contact information for both of us on this first slide, and I will share the presentation with you after the webinar. So, if you've attended and you're interested in looking over the presentation, I'll make sure you get a copy of it. Okay, so I'm going to begin presenting, and like I said, if you have any questions, please go ahead and let us know. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the most common conditions for which students receive accommodations. So there are quite a few, as you can see here, different reasons that people may apply for accommodations. Now, this specifically is what we're talking about, the accommodations for students that are planning to take the SAT or the ACT. Now, of course, at this point in time, there are some students that are not planning to use the SAT or ACT because of the fact that many of the colleges are test optional at the moment. And so that's an individual choice that you have to make with your student about whether they're going to do the SAT or ACT. But if you choose to do that, then these are the kinds of things that are available for people who have one of these conditions. And these are the most common conditions. So there may be some other conditions that are not listed here. I've just tried to put the most common ones down. Okay, now the second slide here is the most common accommodations that students will receive. So extended time is by far the most common one. And most of the students that we work with that receive accommodations are getting extended time. Most often it's an extra 50% time on the test. And generally that means you're going to be getting 50% extra time on each section of the test. It's also possible to get double time, and in some cases, if you get double time, you can take the test over multiple days. So the accommodations vary. It's also possible to get an accommodation where you are allowed to use a computer, either using a word processing function or for another purpose, maybe to have the text read to you. If you're using a computer on the SAT, you have to take it at your own school. You can't go to another test center to do it. And another accommodation that's common is extra breaks or extended breaks. Okay, then we have a few other accommodations. So reading and seeing accommodations, you could have large print or braille or pre-recorded audio, and in some cases you can even have a human reader to read the text. Another one is for students with certain conditions, you can use a 4-function calculator on the no calculator section of the SAT. So normally there's a section on the SAT that allows you to use a calculator, and then there's another section that you're not allowed to use a calculator. But based on the type of disability that you have, you may be allowed to do that. And then you can see there's a couple of other options here. There's a scribe to transfer the answers to the bubble sheet, etc. So these are things to keep in mind, and these are the kinds of accommodations you could ask for. So how do we request accommodations? The first thing to know is that the process can take a while. It can take 2 months or maybe even more. So if you're thinking about applying for accommodations for the SAT or ACT, you really need to start the process early. If you qualify, you're going to need to work with the counselor at your school, whether it's the college counselor or your regular guidance counselor, depending on how your school does the counseling. But you're going to need their help to provide the kind of documentation that's required to get accommodations. And generally, in order to get accommodations, you will have to have a student that's already receiving the accommodations during their regular school. So whether, if it's extended time, which like I said is the most common one, they typically have to already be getting extended time granted to them in school. So what type of documentation is required? Well, you have to have assessments documenting your disability. And the assessments have to be done by a licensed professional that is the appropriate professional for the type of disability that you have. So for certain kinds of learning disabilities, you need to have a school psychologist or a licensed psychologist that does those types of evaluations. And they have to be relatively current. If it's an ACT test, they have to be within the past 3 years. If it's an SAT, it has to be within the past 5 years. And all of these things are going to go through a vetting process by either the College Board or the ACT, and they're going to come back and say, well, we need this information, we need that information. It's going to vary depending on your individual circumstances. In terms of proof that you're already receiving accommodations, they may ask to see an IEP or a 504 plan when you apply. These are the websites that you can check out on either the SAT or on their websites to determine and to get a lot more detailed information. The information that I'm providing here is pretty basic, and as you go and look at these websites, you'll see that there's a lot more information that you're going to need to look through if you're interested in applying for accommodations. And in the case of the ACT, you have to actually register for the exam prior to requesting accommodation. So you really have to have your ducks in a row at the time, because you're going to need to apply for the registration for the test, and then you're going to need to go through their process and provide all the material that they need. So you really need to do your homework on this to make sure you have the information you need, and make sure that you're already in touch with the folks at your school and other professionals that are going to provide the documentation that's required for this process. If you have any other questions about this, feel free to send us a chat, or like I said, I'd be happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tina, and if she has, if you have questions for her, please again just go ahead and put them into the chat. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Tina Gregor, and happy to be here this evening and talking about such an important topic. I want to say thank you to Dan for including me in tonight's webinar. We've done a lot of work together over the last, close to 20 years when we started our company, College Pursuit. So it's not live, but it's better than not being together and again talking about such an important topic. I wanted just to sort of lay out some of the concepts that we would consider tonight, and then we'll take a slightly deeper dive into a few of these items. Certainly the value and importance of self-reflection for our young men and women that have a learning difference and are considering what list of colleges would be appropriate for them to spend their next 4 to 5 years. Understanding, really having clarity around their learning style and their learning difference, and the best fit in terms of an academic setting. Students understanding the resources that they've used throughout high school, their strategies and tools that help them be successful in high school is certainly very important. And then, really understanding how best to research the colleges and determine the appropriate level of support. Colleges, they try to be transparent with a lot of their offerings, but again, their goal is to have as many students apply as they possibly can. We sometimes need to do some really thorough research as we're determining if a college is a good fit. And for a student with a learning difference, really understanding what they have to offer to support them and what level of support they need. So that research does take time and is important. Understanding the considerations when communicating the specific learning style and deciding whether to disclose or not to disclose a learning difference on your applications. So some of those are the items that we would want to talk about tonight. Dan, am I able, I'm not seeing where I can flip my slide. I feel like I've lost the ability to do that. There you go. So I wanted just to give you a sense of, I put these two stats here on this page for a reason. The first is somewhat obvious, to say that approximately 5 to 9% any given year of students are disclosing and using resources and declaring themselves as students with learning differences that are applying to college. And what we've learned over the last 10 years, and then the second stat sort of moves around a little bit, it's been as high as 35%, that approximately 30% of students transfer. And when we've looked into, out of that, again, approximately 30%, we often find that students that transfer for a handful of reasons: distance, major, they decide they want to major in something different, and the school that they first decided upon doesn't have that major. That is a common reason. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's a student athlete scenario, but it's not uncommon for students that have learning differences to have found themselves really independent during their high school years rather. And then as they transfer, as they transition into college, thinking that they don't need certain resources and services because they've been successful in the latter part of high school. And that transition can be a bit more difficult than they initially thought. And that can create, a tough start. And so that, I put those two stats sort of next to each other just to have that thought and that concept. Dan, you can move to the next one. Thank you. So when I'm working with our students, students with or without learning differences, we constantly are referring to a SMART list and how to create a SMART list. And in creating a SMART list, we want it to be schools that yield options and reflect the students' values and goals, and obviously distance from home and size and so many different factors. Again, partly because of what we just talked about, creating a SMART list with a student that has a learning difference is certainly equally, if not more important, because they really need to know that this is going to be a good fit. So how do we do that? And we'll talk a little bit more about self-reflection, certainly research, campus visits, and certainly balancing the need and availability. And that's a really critical point. And what I mean by that is, if a student is really clear that they need a certain resource and accommodation, that those are the resources and accommodations and support they really need to make sure are available. And balancing that need, whether again it's critical or if it's just a preference or if it's something that they hope would be there, but if it's not, then it's not the end of the world. Really evaluating the need and then the availability of those accommodations are very, very important. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I did here is to give you a sense of how often these students, when they're going to meet with the Office of Disabilities, or again, depending on how they're referencing that resource at the different colleges, the DSO is often how they refer to it. They refer to their program as either being structured, coordinated, or basic. That is not uncommon. So if you're looking at colleges and you're trying to determine, because your son or your daughter has the kinds of learning differences that really require some significant support, where they are throughout high school or throughout their entire academic career, they have had several layers of support. That might be what is referred to as a structured program, depending on how the school sees it. Students there are often required to participate in certain programs before they can, move beyond their core curriculum. Sometimes it's a whole separate admission process. So I put some schools there that are examples of colleges that, again, have structured programs. And, American and Hofstra is a good example of two schools that will have a separate application process if, in fact, you're applying to the school that is going to have that level of support. Coordinated programs are certainly going to have support available, and there may be a disability specialist, but that is going to require, a bit more investigation. The structured programs, especially if they're labeling themselves as structured, will be checking a lot of the boxes. The coordinated programs, there's a little bit more of a gray area there, and really trying to understand what it is that is, somewhat important for your son or daughter to have, and does a coordinated program cut it? Does it meet their expectations is important. And then certainly, some students feel really, really confident by the time they've, finished high school, that they're now in a position where they can be more independent. And you'll hear them refer to that. They'll say, look, I really required support from X, Y, and Z professional, or from my counselor, or extended time, but I'm not using that at the latter of my junior year or throughout my senior year, and I believe I can be more independent. And they might be gravitating towards schools that say, hey, we have a basic level of support, what is mandated by law, you're going to want to really look into that and determine, is it enough? It doesn't mean there won't be support there. And there's certainly going to be resources on campus for when students need some help, whether it's editing or proofing, but it might not have the kind of support that your son or daughter would need, especially on the onset as they transition into college. So I'm hopeful that that slide gives you a sense, and we'll end the presentation. Our final slide will give you the name of a resource that has, a variety of colleges, over 300 colleges within that book, that will also label the colleges in this way. Okay. Is that a question that I can look at, Dan? I'm seeing questions.
Yeah, can you, if you can't see it, I can read it to you. Let's see here. So one of the questions is there a bigger list of schools who have structured programs? I think you just answered that question.
Yeah, so there definitely is. I would say certainly that, if it is a structured program, again, they're going to check more of those boxes. So there's no doubt that coordinated and basic programs are going to sort of, have more of that gray, and how they classify themselves may be a little bit more subjective, whereas the structured programs are again going to really need to check a lot of the boxes. And when we look at the K&W guide for students with learning differences and disabilities, you'll see that there are schools that are labeled as structured. Are there as many? Probably, certainly not as many as compared to schools that are coordinated or basic, but there's certainly plenty of schools that have a structured program.
Okay, and the second question here, I'm going to see if I can show it. Does everybody see the question there?
Should we investigate to see if they provide support before applying to attend a college? What advice do you have for technology schools? So absolutely, that's one of the things that, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit as we look at some of the subsequent slides. But when a student has a learning difference, you can and has very specific needs, there is no first and foremost, there's no way that a college is going to know that through the College Board because you got extra time. You can control that anonymity and privacy. That being said, when it's time to apply and you're really trying to determine if this is a good fit, a lot of students will write their essay on their learning difference because of what they've achieved in spite of. And, that's something that we often talk about with our students early on in the process. And if they are applying to a school that is a structured or coordinated program, most likely we want them to visit the campus and really be clear prior to the application what the program offers and what support is available. And if that's something that a student is able to do, and again, the world has changed so much that a lot of these colleges are putting virtual information sessions specifically on, if it's a certain major that a student wants to learn about, or if it's a student that wants to learn about the services that are available to address their learning difference. Much of this has become more transparent because of COVID and students not being able to visit. So there's lots of ways to peel back that onion. And I believe that more often than not, it is something to be revealed. So again, there are circumstances where that's not the case, but I definitely think that you would need to investigate to determine if it's a good fit for your son or daughter. And quite frankly, to really understand that, it is often worth revealing and disclosing the learning difference so that you can have conversations with the professionals within the support program to better understand if it is a good fit. So the answer would be yes.
Now, my question about this for technology schools, maybe you can send us this in the chat, is are you talking about like a sort of a 2-year college, or are you talking about more of a like a 4-year college that has a program in technology? Because I know they're kind of different animals. So let us know, and hopefully we can give you even more information for that. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. Oh, hold on a second. Let's see here. Okay, so the answer to that question is that it's less than 2 years. Okay. So is there anything you would say differently about that, Tina?
I wouldn't. I really wouldn't. I think that obviously, if your son or daughter is gravitating towards a technology school, there's most likely a reason for that, whether it's just where their interests lie, but often it's an area that seems to be better synced for their learning style. And if that is the case, there would certainly need to be, okay, what again are my learning differences? What do I need to be successful in that academic setting? Whether it's the major I declare, the degree I'm pursuing, and what is that academic environment layered in with the structured support that I might need? And if that's a 2-year program or a 4-year program, I don't think those questions and those answers to those questions are necessarily any different.
Okay, so now the next question we have is about a parent saying that her son's school doesn't seem to be providing the help he needs in this regard, and that they said that they don't really do anything to help kids until they're in their senior year. Are you familiar with that?
And is this, when you say not helping with this, is this not helping with the college admission process around the topic of learning differences, or not providing the support needed prior to senior year for them to be successful academically? I'm assuming you mean more along the lines of the determining the right colleges and how to go about the process of accommodations and requesting more time. I'm thinking that's what you mean. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so if you can just put your response in the Q&A, then we can answer that for you. Okay, so in the meantime, we can, I'll just close up the Q&A for now. Okay. But
So that's
feel free
great.
to continue to give us that information.
Now, why don't you go ahead to the next slide, and then, perhaps that will give that. Okay, great. So this is just sort of highlighting what we've been talking about, right? That again, if students really understand, if they were to look at a long list of ways that they could be supported, so that they would be successful in their academic endeavors in college, they might look at this list. And I'm again, this is just from my working with kids now for, again, close to 20 years with our business, that very often you'll hear their journey of where they may have gotten diagnosed with their learning difference in 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th grade. Sometimes it is later, but as they got diagnosed, then they built in the layers of support. And then as high school, maturity, puberty, all kinds of things start to, go down a slightly different path, they aren't as dependent on some of these items. You'll hear students talk about dyslexia and how early on, maybe late in middle school, early in high school, they really used their extended time. But then as high school went on and they learned sort of how to manage, what they needed to manage to be successful either in their assignments or in their quiz or test taking, they found themselves having more time than they needed and sometimes backing off of that time and still having success. That's one example. What I would say to students, though, as they're thinking about college, is reference back to when they were using sort of the most beefed up, toolkit that they had. And that doesn't mean that's what they'll need in college. It's just important to self-reflect on what they needed, not just to be successful, but to become confident in their abilities academically. And that could be 2 or 3 of these items. It could be, okay, in my STEM classes, I do need a separate testing environment, or, I really do better if I have the written instructions for assignments that they just can't be, the teacher saying them out loud. I need to be able to look and make sure that I really understand what the assignment entails. So when I'm working with a student with a learning difference, we really go back in history and talk about when they got diagnosed. Was it an accurate diagnosis right out of the gate? Because sometimes it takes there's a couple, bob and weaves, if you will, before that perfect diagnosis happens. And then what was that journey like, and what are the things that they needed? And that might help you determine, do I need a structured program, or is a basic program with what they have at school reasonable, or is a coordinated program more appropriate? So hopefully that's helpful.
Let me ask you a question, Tina. Based on what your experiences with the students that you've worked with over the years,
Sure.
what would you say are typically surprises that students or parents might have after they go through this process and they end up at the college? And also, what happens? I mean, generally, do students try to get more accommodations or more of these kind of services in place than they actually end up using?
So I'll answer the second part of that first. Yes, I think that there's some things that happen at college that are both sort of like a double-edged sword, where they have more time than they often did in high school. So that can be a good thing if they're really organized and they use that time wisely. But that can also be for students. Certainly, this is a trend for students that don't have a learning difference, where the extra time that they have in their schedule, because they're not being put, they're not in 5 different clubs and playing a sport and, have 6 or 7 classes, they have more time. And that is something that can, again, be a good thing, but could also create, some issues. The other thing that is very common is that having a lecture style class for, your gen ed courses in college. So you're going to be an English major, but you still have to, depending on the college you're going to, you still have some courses that you need to take to, meet the requirements of the general education. Sometimes those classes are a lot larger in size than a student has experienced in high school. And when that is the case, they may have found, okay, I need to sit at the front of the class. Maybe they sat at the front of the class in the early part of high school, but as they became better note takers and less distracted or whatever it might be, they might have, forgot that strategy as something important. So larger classes, not necessarily having your own room to study in, where you're not being distracted by a roommate, not having necessarily some of the, peer support, because you're just making friends. And peer support is certainly something that a lot of high school students that have a learning difference depend upon, whether it's group studying and so on. So some of those early adjustments and factors and having students bulk up on what they think they might need, and then as college goes on and they adjust, they can shed some of those support resources. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think that's that provides a lot of information. That basically people should be sort of a little bit over prepared in terms of what they're expecting to have available, even if they don't necessarily need it. And like you said, maybe they need it in the beginning, but over time that
Absolutely.
they'll need less of it. So yeah.
And just one other point, if your son or daughter is at a school that is a structured program, you may have, you will have an advisor that is going to help you make some of those decisions if you decide to not take advantage of everything. But if you're at a school where it's a coordinated program or even basic services, whether you do or you don't take advantage of these is really nobody else is making sure of that. And it's not as if anybody's going to say, hey, you signed up for extended time in your classes. You always have to take extended time. That's not how it's going to go. You'll be able to make changes, based on the circumstances, the class size, your connection with the teacher, how the material is being presented, how you've transitioned to that college. So all of that can be adjusted. But if you don't start with that in place, you can dig a hole.
And it sounds like you also have to be, you have to advocate for yourself. You have to
100%.
open your mouth and say, hey, I need this thing. I would imagine some professors are more open to it and more sort of prepared to provide these things than others. And I'm sure there are situations where the students really have to push for it, even though they're entitled to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, one other question about if a student is planning to attend a school, are there things that are provided, let's say the summer before they attend, that are going to help them with the transition?
Some schools will have a summer program that students will take advantage of, but it's certainly there's obviously schools that have a summer program that you were admitted to. Penn State has that summer program. Some of the other larger universities will have a summer program, and they may recommend or even require certain students to attend those programs before they are officially accepted into the university. Other schools, if in fact some of those schools that have structured programs may do, a sort of a ramping up where you would come to campus a little earlier and make sure those things are in place and get acclimated so that you can, make that transition a bit smoother. But again, Dan, I think you used the right word, which is advocate and researching. And it goes back to the question that someone asked tonight. Do we really investigate this prior to applying? And the answer is 100% yes. And you can do that with anonymity in place, or you could do that with transparency in place, really to understand what is available, so that if it is a summer program, you might want to take advantage of it.
It sounds also like, with students who have these kinds of needs, they have to probably start preparing, a year or two in advance with respect to advocating for themselves and really being involved in the process of, figuring out what they're going to need to do when they are on campus.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say, and again, this is not a plug for College Pursuit, I promise, but one of the things that parents have expressed to me, and many of you that are listening tonight, you might say that it's difficult, right? Because as a young adult that might have gone through sort of a painful journey with a learning disability or a learning difference, turned the corner, figured out what he or she needed, whether it was a combination of services and medication and support and counseling, whatever it might have been, turn the corner, now having success, and to have this conversation that says, okay, we now need to go back in time, remember everything that happened, what you needed, just in case. A lot of young adults, and understandably so, are not particularly open to that. They're saying, look, been there, done that, I'm successful now, I'm a good student, I really don't want my first step into the next 4 years to start with, I have a learning difference or I have a learning disability, because they don't want that label. They've sort of worked, many, I'm not saying all, but many young adults have said, I've worked sort of beyond that. I know what I need, and I know what I need to be successful. And my role with students many times is to sort of share with them, different than the parent, that this is not something that they need to commit to. It's not something that they have to declare, even though, again, more often than not, there's value to it. It's really about researching it and understanding it so that you're choosing a college that if you need it, it's there. And when a young adult can say, okay, this does not mean I'm going backwards. It really means that I'm looking ahead and making sure I have in place what I need, and sort of thinking about that differently. More often than not, they're a bit more receptive, because it does feel like a step backwards if they've turned that corner and feeling more successful with what they've gone through. So I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but I thought I would just sort of share that.
So you're saying it could sort of be like a level of security for you, that it's there even if you
Sure
don't plan to really take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to go to I know time-wise, we probably, if we can move through these next two slides pretty quickly, because it's somewhat redundant to what we've been talking about, or I should just say repeating, not redundant. But
well, let's go ahead and do that, and then again, if anybody can feel free to put some questions up for us to answer.
So in looking at these next 4 points, we've talked about, what has helped you be successful in high school, and also considering your strengths and challenges, talking with your son or daughter, or having someone talk to your son or daughter about, okay, what really are your academic strengths and challenges. Honestly, one of the things that I think is really unique in a positive way about young adults who have had a learning difference or disability is they typically are more self-aware, because they've had to sort of go through this journey differently. It wasn't as if they just, never gave thought to how they learned, or never gave thought to their academic environment. And so this is something, them being more self-aware and often more mature can be a really good thing. So the Disability Service Office, if students are open to it, if you are going to go down that path and meet with, a counselor at that office, it's sometimes nice to have the parent there. I would say to parents that are listening, don't make this a World War III moment. If the student wants to, go down that path independently, that could be important enough to not fight that battle. You could always email that counselor or advisor separately if you feel like there's really need to advocate for your son or daughter differently. One of the things that I would also do is, when you're meeting with your the different teachers for teacher conferences, is really start paying attention when you hear your teacher say that your son or daughter really does well in a certain type of environment, or participates differently when the topics are presented differently. If you start to hear common threads of what are the teaching methods or academic environment that best suits your son or daughter, that could be helpful. Again, I don't know how young or old the students or the parents that are listening tonight, but if you have a sophomore, you're going to have a handful more teacher conferences in the next year and a half, and that would be worthwhile listening to. And then, the recent documentation is important to really understand that documentation that Dan referred to earlier. Not just to know what the diagnosis is, but if you need the provider, the psychologist that did the testing to really in plain speak explain what it is, that can also be really helpful when you go to advocate for your son or daughter.
And it's also required at some of these colleges, right? You have to have that assessment.
But absolutely, you need the assessment, but sometimes the assessment itself will give you some really great language, especially if you understand it. That it just can be a pretty meaty report. And as parents, I certainly know with my son who has a learning difference, just getting the diagnosis felt like, okay, now we know what it is. But really understanding what it is and how it differs, that it's a name, it's a label, but then really understanding what that means for him and having that conversation with the psychologist and listening to their observations when they did the testing will make you a better advocate for when it's time to advocate.
I think also some of the folks that do those types of evaluations are better than others at providing the type of information that you need that's actionable in terms of the suggestions for strategies and techniques. So that's another consideration when you do get one of those, because you want to make sure that you're not relying on information you got when the student was in 5th grade. You want something that's going to be much more up to date and relevant. Okay, let me go to the next slide.
Here are some of the campus resources that are, again, these are centers and programs that are going to be different than that slide that both Dan had in his piece as well as mine with the funnel, where it's a calculator or extended time or an audio. Those are very specific and geared towards the student. These are the kind of resources that are on the campuses. Some schools are going to have all of these. Some are going to have some of them. Understanding what these centers provide, and that might be able, to allow your son or daughter to say, because this school, school A has all of these resources, maybe I don't need a structured program. Maybe I'd be okay with a coordinated program because it has a writing center. It has, the tutoring and the learning center. It has the peer mentoring center, and because it has all those things, and I understand how it's available, how that support is distributed, I feel really confident that a coordinated program will suffice if I get into some trouble. So that's why it's important to understand how these centers and these resources would be layered in to the more student-specific support.
I would just add one thing to that, and I don't know how often this is a possibility, but I would imagine that if you're able to speak to a student who attends one of these schools that you're interested in, they could really help you understand how this could be beneficial for you, in what ways you could take advantage of it.
100%. I mean, I think that because again, some of our young men and women that have gone through, dealing with the learning difference and having to understand their learning style, and have probably talked to more adults than they wish to have talked to about what they needed and what they needed to do differently, that whenever they can connect with a peer that is managing some of the same or similar, and it doesn't always have to even be similar. It doesn't have to be the same diagnosis or needs, but just another young man or woman that has gone and used some of these services or explored how to incorporate this support into their college life, I think can be really empowering and liberating, quite frankly, for a young man and woman that is transitioning to college.
I think it also can make it more concrete for them,
Yeah,
rather than just this big abstraction of these are all these things. You can talk to somebody who's really kind of knows what's actually happening on the ground.
100%. And it could be, Dan, it could be, don't bother going to the writing center. It's
Right.
not helpful. It's much more helpful to go to the tutoring and your peer mentoring. They'll read your papers, and the writing center it's not. It could be, unfortunately, hearing that it's not a worthwhile resource.
That's true. And if just also they can sort of give you an overview of the culture of the place
Yep.
generally. Okay, let me go to the last slide here. And this is the book that you wanted to let people know about.
Yeah, and I would say this is a book that those of us who have been, helping students with learning differences really sort of depend on. And there's a lot of other great guides out there, but this one has been around for a long time. And as schools have layered in more resources and more support, they'll sort of change their labeling. So when we talked earlier about the structured and the coordinated and basic support, but there's a lot of colleges in here, and again, there are other resources that I think are worthwhile. But if I were to leave you with one, it would be the K&W Guide to Colleges for Students with Learning Differences. And so hopefully this would be something that would provide you with some help. I made a note here that I didn't want to interrupt Dan when he was doing his presentation, but he talked about how it's very common for students to have time and a half. And one of the things that's been really helpful for my students that I've referred to A+ and to Dan is that if a student is unclear whether extra time is helpful, I have asked A+ to administer a practice test and proctor it with time and a half, and then being able to compare that score to a test that did not have extra time. And if a student is trying to determine whether they need or would benefit from extra time, and it's not clear based on their academic, test taking, but obviously, it's not very often up until the SAT or the ACT, it's not often that a student would be taking a 3-hour and 20-minute test. So, Dan, I don't know if you have any additional comments there, but that's been a very helpful way for me to advise my students with a learning difference that are trying to decide whether they want to do that, is to ask to do a proctored test that's time and a half and see if their score increases simply by having that additional time.
Yeah, I mean, we offer free proctored exams for students that are interested in finding out how they would score on a practice test if they've never done it before. And we have kids that do it with extended time, and they can do an SAT like that and an ACT, and we can help them compare to see which one might be a better fit for them as well. And it's true, some kids that qualify for it may not really benefit from it, but it's definitely
Right.
worth trying to see.
Sure.
Before you make the decision. It's always good to have the option. And then, I think it's true with some of these other, accommodations as well. Like, are you really going to benefit from it? Are you going to take advantage of it? That's something you have to figure out, so you understand the pros and cons. Because there is a con. If you're taking a test that's 3.5 hours and you get the extra time, now you're talking about 5 hours. So you have to really decide which is the better approach.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So we're going to finish up here. If anybody has any other questions, please let us know. As I mentioned earlier, I will be sharing the presentation slides with everybody. And let me just go back to the beginning. We have our contact information here.
And Dan, I also just want to remind everybody that we have what we call the College Pursuit Journal, which is an interactive tool and guide for college-bound families. It does have a section in it for students with learning differences, but it is, certainly a much more general guide as well. It has a financial aid section and a student athlete section, and components of an application and how to visit, tips and best practices to visit. So everybody that's attended tonight, we are happy to share the journal with you. And so maybe I'm just going to need a way to get that to you, and we can mail it, or we can figure that out, but just know that that's available.
Yeah, I'll include in the email that I send out to everybody information about that. And if you would like to get a copy of the guide, which is really fabulous, I mean, it's really very comprehensive and user-friendly, you can just provide us with your mailing address, and we'll get a copy out to you. So that's it for tonight. I really appreciate everybody attending. And Tina, thank you so much for taking the time to
well, thank you for the opportunity. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. One person gave us their address, but we'll ask you to provide that via email. So thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Has a good night. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.